In 1933, a Ukrainian grandmother named Lydia watched her neighbors collapse from starvation in the streets. Children disappeared, entire families vanished overnight. Yet for decades, the world was told this never happened. What you're about to discover is one of history's most deliberately hidden genocides. A man-made famine that claimed the lives of nearly 4 million Ukrainians, engineered by Joseph Stalin to crush Ukrainian independence forever. Today, we're uncovering the truth about the Holodomor, the genocide that was erased from history books for over 50 years. The word Holodomor literally means death by starvation in Ukrainian. Between 1932 and 1933, this systematic campaign of terror transformed Ukraine, known as the breadbasket of Europe, into a land of unimaginable suffering. In this video, we'll examine the historical evidence that proves this wasn't just a famine, but a calculated genocide. We'll explore how Stalin weaponized hunger, why Ukraine was specifically targeted, and how this tragedy was covered up for decades. Most importantly, we'll understand why recognizing this genocide matters more than ever today. But first, we need to understand the Ukraine that existed before Stalin's terror began. To understand the Holodomor, we must first picture Ukraine in the early 1900s. After centuries of foreign rule, Ukraine briefly tasted independence in 1918, following the collapse of the Russian Empire. The Ukrainian People's Republic declared its sovereignty, uniting Ukrainian territories for the first time in centuries. But this independence was short-lived. By 1922, Ukraine was forcibly incorporated into the newly formed Soviet Union, becoming the Ukrainian Soviet Socialist Republic. Despite this political subjugation, Ukrainian culture was thriving. About 80% of Ukraine's population lived in rural areas, working as independent farmers on some of the world's most fertile soil. These weren't just farmers. They were the guardians of Ukrainian identity. They preserved the language, traditions, and the deep connection to the land that defined what it meant to be Ukrainian. This cultural strength would soon make them a target. When Joseph Stalin consolidated power in the mid-1920s, he faced what he considered an existential threat: Ukrainian nationalism. Ukraine's cultural autonomy was strengthening, and Stalin feared this could lead to a Ukrainian revolution that would tear apart his Soviet empire. As historian Timothy Snyder noted, the Ukrainian Holodomor meets the criteria of the 1948 Genocide Convention. It meets the ideas that Raphael Lemkin laid down. Lemkin, who coined the term genocide, identified 4 components of the genocidal process in Ukraine: the elimination of Ukrainian intellectuals, the destruction of the Ukrainian Orthodox Church, the starvation of Ukrainian farmers, and their replacement with non-Ukrainians. Stalin's solution was systematic and brutal. He began with mass arrests and executions of Ukrainian intellectuals, church leaders, and Communist Party members who supported Ukrainian policies. Thousands were eliminated to, as historians describe it, decapitate the leadership of the country. But Stalin's most devastating weapon was yet to come. In 1928, Stalin announced his first 5-year plan, which included the collectivization of agriculture. This policy forced independent farmers to surrender their land, livestock, and tools to work on government-controlled collective farms called collectivization. For Ukrainian farmers who had worked independently for generations, this was devastating. They resisted en masse. Historians have documented approximately 4,000 local rebellions against collectivization in the early 1930s. The Soviet secret police and Red Army ruthlessly suppressed these protests. Stalin labeled resistant farmers as kulaks, a term meaning wealthy peasants, and declared them enemies of the state to be eliminated as a class. Hundreds of thousands were arrested, shot, or deported to labor camps. Their land was confiscated for the collective farms. But resistance continued, and Stalin realized he needed a more final solution. Here's where Stalin's plan became genocidal. In 1932, he set impossibly high grain procurement quotas for Ukraine, 356 million poods of grain, far beyond what the region could produce. When farmers inevitably failed to meet these quotas, Stalin's response was swift and merciless. Soviet forces swept through Ukrainian villages, confiscating not just grain, but anything edible: livestock, vegetables, even seeds for the next planting season. Everything was taken. The infamous Law of Five Stalks of grain decreed that anyone, even a child, caught taking any produce from a collective field could be shot or imprisoned for stealing socialist property. But Stalin went further. He introduced the blacklist system. Entire villages that failed to meet grain quotas were surrounded by troops, blockaded from receiving any supplies, and their residents were forbidden from leaving. It was, as historians describe it, essentially a collective death sentence. The most telling evidence of genocidal intent came in January 1933, when Stalin and his closest collaborator, Molotov, issued directives preventing Ukrainians from leaving their villages to search for food. They sealed Ukraine's borders, trapping 22.4 million people within the starving territory. By the spring of 1933, mortality in Ukraine reached catastrophic proportions. At the peak in June 1933, 28,000 people were dying every day. That's 1,168 people every hour, 20 people every minute. Contemporary Soviet police archives contain heartbreaking descriptions of the suffering. People ate grass, acorns, tree bark, anything that might provide sustenance. Families like Lydia's, whose story we heard at the beginning, survived by hiding grain in barrels buried under trees, making flour at night when no one could see the smoke from their windows. Despite this unimaginable suffering, Ukrainians showed remarkable resilience and humanity. Lydia risked her own life to sneak bread and milk to her starving neighbors, helping 7 out of 9 family members survive. What makes this tragedy even more horrific is that it was entirely preventable. While Ukrainians were dying, the Soviet state extracted 4.27 million tons of grain from Ukraine in 1932, enough to feed 12 million people for an entire year. Soviet records show that in January 1933, there were enough grain reserves in the USSR to feed over 10 million people. Stalin didn't just engineer the genocide. He orchestrated one of history's most successful cover-ups. Throughout the crisis, he outright denied that any famine was taking place. He banned Soviet press from reporting on the famine and prohibited foreign correspondents from entering Ukraine. The few journalists who tried to report the truth faced fierce opposition. Walter Duranty of the New York Times, who won a Pulitzer Prize for his reporting on Stalin's 5-year plan, actively denied the famine, writing, "There is no actual starvation or deaths from starvation, but there is widespread mortality from disease due to malnutrition." Meanwhile, journalist Gareth Jones, who snuck into Ukraine and wrote about the reality of the famine, was largely ignored. His articles describing how famine ruled Russia were overshadowed by Duranty's more influential denials. Stalin destroyed archives, ensured death certificates didn't list starvation as a cause of death, and when the 1937 census showed a dramatic population drop in Ukraine, he had the census compilers arrested and some executed. The census was never made public. For over 50 years, the Soviet Union successfully suppressed knowledge of the Holodomor. In Ukraine, it was impossible to speak publicly about the famine until the late 1980s. The truth survived only through whispered family stories, passed down through generations like Lydia's account that her great-grandson, Rostislav, preserved. The breakthrough came in the 1980s with the publication of the U.S. Commission on the Ukraine Famine Report and the documentary Harvest of Despair, which finally brought international attention to this tragedy. In 2006, Ukraine's parliament officially recognized the Holodomor as genocide. Today, 16 nations and 22 U.S. states, including Minnesota, have recognized it as genocide. However, Russia continues to deny historical responsibility, falsely claiming the famine affected Russia equally. The Holodomor stands as one of history's most deliberate and systematic genocides. Recent demographic studies estimate that 3.9 million Ukrainians died during 1932 to 1933, with some regions losing up to 29% of their population. This wasn't just a tragedy of the past, it's a warning for the present. As we've seen in recent years, similar tactics of disinformation and denial are being used to justify violence against Ukrainians today. Understanding the Holodomor helps us recognize these patterns and stand against them. The survivors like Lydia, who risked everything to help their neighbors, remind us that even in humanity's darkest moments, compassion and courage can prevail. Their stories, preserved against all odds, ensure that this genocide will never again be hidden from history. What aspects of the Holodomor do you think are most important for people to understand today? Share your thoughts in the comments below and let me know what other historical events you'd like me to cover in future videos. If this video helped you understand this crucial piece of history, please give it a like and subscribe for more in-depth historical documentaries. Your support helps ensure these important stories continue to be told, with the hope that such tragedies will never be repeated. Until we meet again, farewell.